All right, Jamie, thank you very much. Steve, thank you very much. Would somebody tell me if you can hear me clearly? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Am I coming in loud enough and clear enough?
Yes, you are, Neil.
Okay, good, thank you. Hang on a second. All right. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak. Just a warning, I'm actually in a hotel in Jacksonville, Florida at the moment, and we seem to have a thunderstorm coming in. So it should be okay, but in case something gets hit and we lose connection, bear with me and we'll get back in. So anyhow, subject of this presentation, RoboCop and HLMT Redux. And I was pleased to see that when I turned the slides and the description over, somebody actually suggested that there were a number of major spelling errors on the title page. And there are, but they weren't my fault, as you'll see. So basically, this is who I am. Jamie, thank you for that introduction. To extend it just a little bit, I've been doing this for a while. I started in February of '79, so I'd rather not do the math. I was a partner in a hypertext consulting company in '86 through 1990, split off from my partners because of disagreements about marketing, and founded Hyperword Services and pretty much ran from there. So I've been doing mobile since 1998, XML since '99, apps since 2011, and getting into a number of other things as well, some of which I'll talk about as I go through this presentation because they will be appropriate. So anyhow, we all have war stories or horror stories. By the way, bear with me, I've been talking nonstop for 3 days. And I'm very dry, so I'm clearing my throat occasionally, which is why I'm muting. Anyhow, we all have war stories or horror stories. These are the kinds of stories that we tell or at the bar at a conference. And in fact, had we done this presentation live, I was going to suggest to Steve and Jamie that they cater it with beer. But since we can't do that, what I want to do is discuss the lessons. So the lessons, the problem is that there are some really valuable lessons in these horror stories, but they get lost because staff turnover means that the people who were involved in those horror stories and maybe responsible for them are gone. And stories, the organizational memory just doesn't get passed down. The problem, though, is that these lessons are becoming increasingly valuable as technical communication becomes increasingly complex. You've all heard of AR, augmented reality. You may have heard of Information 4.0. This is a concept, sort of a framework that's come out of Germany several years ago. I've been writing about for several years and speaking about, but this is making TechCom, as I say, increasingly complex because we're getting heavily into technologies like search engine optimization, Internet of Things, and a whole bunch of other technologies that are making us sound less like technical communicators and more like programmers. So my goals today are to describe some of my greatest war stories, and whether or not they're greatest will be up to you, but they're the ones that are the most memorable to me and the ones out of which I've drawn the most lessons. I'm telling these partly for cheap laughs. This presentation came about because I was talking to somebody at a conference and we were swapping war stories. And this person suggested, you know, there's really got to be a presentation here. And I didn't have to get kicked too hard. So the idea is also to show historical continuity, because since we lose the corporate memory, the organizational memory, we tend to make the same mistakes today that we made 15, 20, in some cases 25 years ago. And draw lessons, and I'm going to suggest that you do the same. because you folks probably have as many horror stories as I do. Some of them may be better than some of mine. I would debate this, but again, this is why we discuss horror stories at the bar. But feel free to contribute your own stories as I go through this presentation. So with that, let me start off with one of my favorites from 1997. And this was a client south of Boston. And in the discussion about this internet thing, I asked the client, what browser do you use? And the client said to me, what's a browser? So, okay. I said, well, how do you access your company's intranet? Because at the time, the company was quite forward thinking. They actually had an intranet. And the response was, we click that big blue E icon on the screen in Windows. Do you know what that is? So there was a serious misunderstanding here of the terminology. They were using the terms, but they really didn't know what they meant. And, you know, we can laugh at these stories. Here's another example. Only 3 years later, but I was at another client, turned to me at a break in a meeting and said, Neil, what is HLMT anyway? And I said, Jamie, forgive me. I said, Jamie, I don't know. I've never heard of this. And the client said, gee, I'm surprised. It has to do with this internet thing, so we assumed you would know about it. And then the light dawned. And I said, okay, no, it's HTML. It's a language that's used to create web pages. And the client said, oh, okay, and wandered off to get coffee, and everything was fine. This was 19 years ago. In 2003, and this may be one of my top 3 horror stories, I was hired by a hospital in central Ohio that wanted to move its procedure documents from paper, done in Word, to online form, done at the time, this would have been in RoboCop, but I was out there for, I think, 2 days, and my job was to look at as many documents as I could and try to predict what kinds of problems they might face as they went online. So we started off with a meeting. The first morning, there was me, the president of the hospital, the head of IT, somebody else, and the head of nursing, the nursing director. And I happened to turn to the nursing director and I said, I'll bet you folks have a lot of graphics in your procedures. And she said, oh yeah, we have tons of them. And I said, I assume you put them in using standard cut and paste. And she said, well, yes, of course. Okay. So the meeting ended and they plopped me down at a desk and gave me some files and said, have fun. And I was looking at the file, one of the documents, and I realized there was a missing graphic. So I called the nursing director up and I said, you're missing a graphic. And she said, oh, that's terrible. Where are you? What page are you on? And I said, such and such a document, such and such a page. And she hesitated for a second. And she said, Neil, how are you looking at the document? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, are you online? Are you looking at it on the screen? And I said, yes. And I heard her voice change to sort of, what kind of incompetent consultant have we brought in? And she said, Neil, you know that you can only look at the graphics when the document is printed. And I had a blank, totally blank moment. And then I said, when I said cut and paste this morning, did you mean, and she said, why, yes, we cut them out and we paste them in using double-faced tape. And I sort of lost my voice for about a second. And if this wasn't bad enough, I said, where are you getting these documents? Where are you getting these images? And she said, oh, we copy them out of medical textbooks. And I just said to her, we need to talk. And so I went to her office and I explained what copyright violations were. And I explained what the meaning of cut and paste was. And at the end of about a 2 or 3 minute discussion, she just looked at me in absolute horror and just said, oh dear. So these people totally misunderstood the terminology. What does cut and paste mean? Scissors and double-faced tape. Never mind the issue of copyright violations. My point here is that it was common to misunderstand the terminology back in the 1990s, or even the 80s for that matter. But this was pretty common because the technology was so new. The problem is we still misunderstand the terminology today because the terminology is still new. What's mobile? What's SEO? What's search engine optimization? And I'll tell you a wonderful mobile story in a few minutes that really explains how we still misunderstand terminology and the technology today, 20 years after some of these horror stories took place. So the result can be silly or serious or both, as happened with my hospital in Ohio. So if you're doing any work, and I think I recognize everybody's names, but what I don't know is whether you all have real jobs, so to speak, or whether any of you are working as consultants. But it doesn't matter. Whether you have a real job or you're going in on a consulting basis the way I do, you can never assume that everybody understands what you're talking about, that everybody understands the basic terminology that's involved in whatever project you're involved with. You can sort of assume that the direct participants do, sort of, but I've got some examples later on of cases where even that was assuming too much. And you never assume that the indirect participants, the people from the marketing department, for example, or finance, or senior management, you never assume that they understand the terminology. You make sure they do. And I've been asked, how do you make sure that they understand the terminology? And I've actually said, hold a meeting. And you tell people the meeting is to make sure that everybody is to review the terminology, to make sure that everybody understands what everybody else is talking about. And I have had some people grumble at the idea, waste of time, we've got better things to do. And I've always said, I'd rather have you grumbling about a waste of time now than grumbling really loudly about $500,000 down the drain 6 months from now because of a terminology misunderstanding. All right, so that's number one. Number two was misunderstanding the technology. And two examples that date back to the late 90s. The first one, web help versus web help. And some of you would have known and may remember a woman named Nan Fritz. She ran a very well-known consulting company, first in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then in Burlington, Massachusetts. But I did work with them for years. One of my jobs was if a client calls up requesting a project and the project doesn't make sense, my job is to talk to the client and figure out what they want. So they got an RFP, request for proposal, from a prospective client. It doesn't matter who. But in the proposal, they were talking about web space help. Okay, that's fine. But the problem was everything that they were describing was really web help, one word. And if you've been in this business for a while, you'll remember web help as the early browser-based outputs before HTML. The problem was the employee who wrote the RFP knew exactly what I think she wanted, and it was web help, one word. And then a reviewing manager looked at the RFP and corrected an obvious typo and changed it to web space help, which completely changed the meaning. So it took me a couple of minutes to get this sorted out. I had another client who was working in a tool called 4Help, which is long gone, but it was the second most popular tool after RoboHelp in the late 90s. And I was doing a training course at the company in New Jersey, and the doc manager asked me if I would stay after the class ended. because they had a project that had gone off the rails and they couldn't figure out what was going on. Could I help? So I said, yeah, do you have any idea what the problem is? And they said, no. Have you talked to tech support? Yes. Were they able to help? No. How long has this been going on? 10 months. And I just said, look, there's no way that I'm going to solve a 10-month problem, but maybe I can pose some questions. So we went back to her office and she spent a couple of minutes explaining the history of the project. And have you ever been in a position where you realize that there really is a God because you're about to pull off a miracle? And I said to her, not only do I know what your problem is, I can fix it with 2 mouse clicks. And she used some language that I last heard coming from a Marine drill instructor and said, go. So I did. Click, click. The problem was that they had gone off and bought this tool called 4Help in order to create HTML help. And they hired somebody who knew 4Help. The problem was they got confused over HTML lowercase h, which was just an online document, a web page, and HTML capital H help, which was an output format that the old tools generated that's still around, although it's fading quickly. So what this person didn't realize was that when they finished creating the project, they needed to do a build, which means you click the build button, and when it finishes building, you click the view button. They didn't realize that. So the project stalled for 10 months because the developer and management didn't understand the concept of build. Simple as that. And when they called support, and support would say, what kind of output are you generating? And the client would helpfully say HTML help. What support was hearing was HTML capital H help. And when support said, have you built the project? And the client said, of course, not realizing what build meant. So this was in the late 90s. 2 years ago, I did some consulting with a very large manufacturing company in the Midwest that brought me in because they were going mobile. And they wanted somebody to evaluate their progress. How are you doing? How are we doing in our move toward mobile? So they brought me out to the Midwest, Illinois, for 2 days. And I think there were 20 people in the meeting, including one guy they'd flown in from China. And after some discussion, it turned out that the company had 3 divisions, A, B, and C. They were all going mobile, but they never talked. They never coordinated, and they never established what the word mobile even meant. So Division A created a mobile app out of a spreadsheet driven by JavaScript, which was one of the most insane things I'd ever seen. It was impressive, but insane. Division B created mobile by hand coding web pages to run as responsive design. And Division C, sorry, hang on a second. So Division A created an app, Division C created responsive design. Division C didn't do anything because they couldn't figure out what the options were, but they were, and I quote, "We will be damned if we do what A and B do because we don't like them." So, total misunderstanding of the technology, and they asked me to evaluate where they stood on a scale from 1 to 5. 5 being you're doing really well, 1 being you're in serious trouble. And at the end of the 2 days, they said to me, everybody turned to me and said, where are we? How do we stand? And I said, I'll give you a 1.5. And then I ran for the car. Because part of the problem was they never set standards, they never set metrics, they refused. One division flatly refused to even set any metrics, and they never defined the technology. What does mobile mean? So again, this was common in the 90s. Problem is, it's just as common today, and we have new technologies coming along. You've all heard of bots or chatbots. Are any of you creating bots or working in bots? Anybody? Okay, it's about what I expect. There's a tremendous amount of talk about bots. They're very cool. There are conferences, particularly in Europe, and some emerging ones here, where everybody is talking about bots and how cool they are, and if you want to be cool, you'd better get one too. But they never quite define what they are. The problem is you can buy the wrong authoring tools, or you might buy the right tools, but use them the wrong way, as my client in New Jersey did with the HTML help. Or you might hire the wrong writer, or you might make all three mistakes. And I've seen this. You probably have too. So again, never assume. You have to understand that the clients, all the participants, understand at least the basics of the technology, and you make sure they do. It's a lot easier for me coming in as an independent consultant than it may be for you, because the assumption is when you bring in a consultant, this guy is coming in from the outside, so he obviously knows more than our employees. Therefore, we'll listen to him or her rather than listen to our employees. So it's harder on those of you who have real jobs, but it's crucial. All right, misunderstanding the actual nature of the work. I'm curious, by the way, does anybody have any comparable horror stories or better horror stories? I'm always up for new ones.
Let me unmute people's microphones for a moment.
Yeah. Yeah, any comments, thoughts, any one-upmanship? Okay. Misunderstanding the work itself. And again, having a client, my cut and paste client, my hospital client, perfect example. This one I've run into repeatedly over the years, probably since around 95 or 96, where the client says, we use fill in the blank, your authoring tool. We were never trained on it. Management bought the tool for us, but told us to teach ourselves. So somebody, a couple of generations ago, the first writers to use this tool wrote down the steps to be followed to create a new project. Okay, the problem was that person may never have been created and may have totally misunderstood the work. I cannot tell you how many times I run into clients who don't quite understand the difference between a full text search and an index. This is very common. They don't understand what browser-based help is versus web-based help, and similar mistakes. And they make mistakes because of these misunderstandings. Only 8 years ago, I had a client in Austin, Texas, who they were using RoboHelp, and they were two young, very bright, very sharp guys. I really liked them. They were a pleasure to work with. They pointed me towards some really good barbecue places, which again elevated them in my eyes. But I spent a lot of time talking about style sheets and what styles were. And one of the guys, after I finished, looked at me and said, you know, we've been wondering what these styles things were, but they never looked. So they were working totally the wrong way by doing local formatting. Another one. This I've actually run into twice this year in January and February, where are any of you user interface people? Anybody in UX? Okay, I just want to know what kinds of jokes I can tell. I had two clients in the space of 2 months who had big UX departments, And the UX people created these interfaces, these really cool looking interfaces using wireframe for their home page. And the clients both said to me, our UX people designed these really cool homepage wireframes. We want you to enable this in Flare. The problem was the UX people had no idea what Flare could do. They never touched code. In fact, they didn't know code. So they simply came up with these designs without thinking, can these be implemented? Can these be made to work? And frankly, I was lucky because I pulled it off with both of them. But each one could have been a disaster. And this was because the client's people didn't understand the work. So again, what's the lesson? If we don't understand the work, if we don't understand the workflow, it's going to cause problems. It's going to cause inefficiencies, some of which may be fixable with workarounds, some of which just plain may not be fixable at all, or may not be fixable unless you get into JavaScript, which adds a whole level of complexity to the projects. So you have to make sure that the clients understand the nature of the work itself. And in the past, we had time to fix our mistakes because time to market for our documentation was longer. Today, content is becoming increasingly important, which means good, efficient, effective workflows are crucial. We no longer have the time to make mistakes and then go back and fix them. All right. Another issue was justification to management. And I actually had a client in 1996, and I absolutely loved these guys. They were one of my favorite clients. They were sharp, they were bright, they were slightly loopy, but they learned fast, and they had a sense of humor. And the client said to me, I said, why did you pick whatever tool it was they were using? And the guy said, well, my daughter came home from college on her freshman break, and she was taking a computer course. And she said to me, Dad, the company has to start creating online help. And the client said, sure, honey. And okay, they started creating online help. Okay. Never really thought about, should we do this? How do we do this? Why are we doing this? Just, sure. Now, this is another one. And this is not that long ago. This is a government agency in DC. And they wanted to switch from an old HTML tool that they adopted in 1999 to go to Flare. And as the guy said, we're having a really tough time justifying to management why we want to go to this new tool, because the old tool seems to be working fine except for a few minor problems. So I said, okay, what are those problems? Can you give me an idea of what kinds of problems you're running into? And the punchline here involves an understanding of CSS down at the code level. So are any of you new to CSS, or just don't work with it at the code level? If anybody wants to give me a chat response, that's fine. I don't want to put anybody in an awkward position. So, okay, good. It's yeah, RoboHelp is pretty powerful. So, okay, good, Catherine, thank you. What happened was nowadays, when we create a topic, the topic title usually uses the head 1 or H1 style. Subtitle uses the H2 style. It's pretty standard. And then the body uses P tags, the paragraph styles. Fine. What this old tool from 1999 did was it used P for everything, but they came up with subclasses. So instead of using the head 1, H1, for the topic title, they would use P. I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like P space class equals 57. unless they used p-space class equals 56. And then for head 2, it might be p-space class equals 94, unless it was class equals 49. In other words, it was totally inconsistent. And the problem was there was no way to fix it, because when I fed the material into RoboHelp, when I fed it into Flare, each one was rolled over and died because they were looking at this code and they couldn't figure it out. And I told the guy, I can fix it for you, but I'm going to have to do it one file at a time, working in the code. And they had something like 5,000 files. And yeah, well, we'll let it go. Maybe we'll fix it next year, which usually means when somebody else is in charge. So the problem was the fact that justifying the cost of a new tool was easy or hard when online doc wasn't taken seriously, when content wasn't taken seriously. It was easy because the tools were relatively cheap. In 1996, I think RoboHelp was $495. Flare didn't even exist. But it was hard thinking about my client in DC because the cost of the tool had gone up. A copy of Flare, I think, was $7.99, but it wasn't the cost of the tool. It was the cost of the work. And all of a sudden, when they found out it was going to cost them tens of thousands of dollars for me to fix the files, they suddenly lost interest. It was hard. It was actually impossible for the guy to run this through management. So problem is that today doc has to fit into corporate environments. It has to support the company's goals. Nobody cares about TechCom goals. Nobody cares what TechCom wants to do. It's, will this support the company's business and strategy? And it's becoming more complex, which means it's becoming more expensive. It's also becoming more rigorous, which means it's becoming more expensive. Coding, proper coding is now becoming crucial. Plus, it has to compete before management with other ideas, because you might come up with a really great proposal, a really great idea for online documentation or online content, except somebody over in the next building has come up with an equally great idea for a new engineering program. And they're both great ideas, but they're competing for money. And that's tough. So it has to be presented on business grounds, how it benefits the company. Any other approach, and I'll change this, I'd say any other approach is likely to fail. I'd say any other approach will fail. Because if it doesn't tell the company how it's going to help them make more money or reduce expenses, which is the same, basically the same thing as making more money, it just won't fly. Or it might fly, but it will get outsourced. All right, so any comments so far? Any questions, arguments? Does anybody think I'm making up these stories? Just curious. Because my in-laws for years accused me of making up these stories because they used to say nobody could work in such a ludicrous environment. Good, Catherine, thank you. Then you'll love this one, because we now move into the ludicrous phase. And this is from 1980. So you figure anything that far back has to be ludicrous by definition. And this may be my absolute all-time favorite. At the time, I was working at Digital Equipment Corporation in their Ed Services division. Steve, you worked at DEC, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
All right, good man. Anybody else work at DEC? This is like a little fraternity. Okay, I was writing the manuals for an application series called DIBS, DIBS, which was the Digital Integrated Business Series. It was a set of accounting packages. And one day, the engineering people got a call from a client who said, we're missing a digit. And the engineering people said, what are you talking about? And the guy said, well, we had an entry like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And all of a sudden, it's 1, 2, blank, 4, 5. We lost the digit 3. So the engineer said, okay, please send us the disks. So the client did, and the client didn't do anything silly like fold the disks in half to fit them into an envelope. Carefully packaged them, padded them, sent them in. The engineers looked at the disks. They were fine. There was nothing wrong with them. And they just put it down to one of these random things and sent the disks back. Okay. Next month, it happens again. And the client sends in the disks. Engineering looks at them. Nothing wrong. Next month, it happens again. And this went on for something like 7 months. And the engineers were tearing their hair out. And one day, by sheer chance, a sales rep was in the client's office before the office opened for business. And just to show you how far back this was before hard disks. This was when computers had floppy disk drives with 5¼ inch disks with drive doors that you could flip open. And it was before the business started. The computer hadn't been turned on. And sitting on top of the monitor was a can of Raid insect repellent. And the sales rep idly said to the client, "What's with the Raid?" And the client said, "Oh, we've heard that there are bugs in computer software." And at this point, every alarm in the sales rep's mind is going off. And he says, "Yeah, what do you do?" And the client said, "Well, every morning before we start at the computer, we give a good, healthy blast of Raid into both disk drives, and it seems to be working because we're only getting 1 bug a month." And what was happening, of course, was that over about a month, you get this layer of dried Raid building up on the surface of the disks. And eventually, you'd start getting little peaks of dried Raid. And eventually, the magnetic read-write head would hit one of the peaks, crash into the surface of the disk, and the impact would break the dried Raid loose, throw it into the back of the monitor housing, of the drive housing, and everything worked except for that one missing digit. So I've actually won bets with this story. But in 1995, still really ludicrous, I had a client who was using RoboHelp. And I sort of idly said to the guy, why did you pick RoboHelp? And his IT manager was in the office, and he piped up and he said, well, my client was the manager of Division A, and he went to visit the manager of Division B. And the second manager showed the first one their new, spanking new online documentation. And the manager of Division A was doing it using Lotus Notes. Have any of you used Lotus Notes? Do any of you remember it?
Yes.
Okay, Steve, I'm really sorry. I wrote the user documentation for Notes 3, so I apologize. But the manager looked at the stuff that was developed at the second division and said, I really like yours better. What tool are you guys using to develop it? And this was about the time when the movie RoboCop had been out for a while. And the manager said, some tool called Robo something. So my client came back and told his IT manager to go off and find RoboCop. And the guy spent a month looking for RoboCop before he accidentally tripped over RoboHelp. And they brought me in. So one of my favorites. Another one, in 1996, I started the online doc SIG of the Boston STC. And since it was so new, since the whole concept was so new, I gave the introductory presentation, what is online documentation, etc. And I was talking about all these authoring tools like RoboHelp and so on. And a couple of days later, a woman who'd been at the meeting called me and said, we're trying to find one of these tools you mentioned called Dr. Help, and we can't find it. And I said, gee, I've never heard of it. And she said, well, you mentioned it several times during the presentation. And we went back and forth for about a minute. And finally, it turned out, we figured out that she thought the name of the tool was Dr. Help, but because this was Boston, and she assumed I was speaking like a Bostonian and calling it Doc to Help, no R. So this is one of the few cases where an accent has actually tripped me up. So what do we do about this? Well, some of these stories are just so ludicrous that they're just impossible to prevent because you just cannot, you don't even know what to expect, what to prepare for. These were my all-time worst. But what they suggest is this, that you make sure your assumptions are right when you start a project, and you recheck them as you go along. You have to keep an eye on changing technologies, changing methodologies, and you perhaps nominate somebody in your doc group to be the person who's in charge of keeping up to date. And periodically, that person's job is to do a lunch and learn, let's say, where they describe new technologies that have come out, new tools that have come out, new terms that have come out, and what the effect might be on your work. Because it's the only way to keep up and keep your projects from going off the rails. So let me just summarize this by saying, to a degree, TechCom is a fairly conservative environment. A lot of us still use FrameMaker. A lot of us still use Word, etc. But we are moving into new areas, sometimes almost without realizing it. 10 years ago, nobody knew what search engine optimization is. Today, a lot of people still don't know what it is, but they're doing it. And it's a new area for many of us. It is outside, way outside our core competency, but we have to do this. This basically sums up the entire presentation. It would be a miracle if we didn't mess up. But as the complexity rises, as the stuff has to get to market faster and faster, mistakes are becoming more expensive. We will never avoid mistakes, but we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. And that's really the point of this presentation, especially when we're talking about potentially something as complex as Information 4.0. All right, I'm curious, are any of you familiar with it, or are any of you even working in it? Anybody heard of this?
I have, but mostly from you.
If nothing else.
Yeah.
You're right, I was gonna say, if nothing else, I hope somebody says yes, just to show me that you're reading my articles. This is very dependent on the ultra granularization, and I'll apologize for making up that word, the ultra granular technology that rather than creating topics, which we do now, as opposed to documents, we create smaller chunks called snippets and still smaller chunks called micro content. And this could be really tough to do just mechanically. But then we also have to deal with contextualization. What's the context in which the users might call for this material? And it could be something that we're accustomed to. You know, what dialog box am I on in an application when I call for help? And based on that context, show me the appropriate chunk of content. But it could be something like, where am I standing outside? Am I standing on the north end of at the north end of the building or the south end? Where am I standing inside the mall? Am I standing in front of Best Buy, or am I standing in front of, you know, some other store? And in each case, the context would depend on geography, either through GPS or a technology from Apple called beacons, which is basically the same, similar to GPS, but more for indoor use. It could be, which way am I holding the smartphone? Am I holding it portrait mode or landscape mode. And we cannot assume that the engineers with whom we deal will know about this stuff. From 2003 to 2006, I was STC's lead rep to the World Wide Web Consortium. And at one point, I was sitting in a meeting and they were discussing context sensitivity. And they discussed geographic context sensitivity and how am I holding the mobile device context sensitivity and several other things. And I raised my hand and I said, what about context sensitivity based on what dialog box you're in an application? And the group leader said, you know, we've never heard of this. Could you describe it to us? And they carved out 20 minutes for me to just stand up and describe it. But if I hadn't known about it, the engineers never would. And there's a lot more to this as well. So the crucial thing is, the more that we can make sure that everybody understands the terminology and the technology and the workflows and is able to justify it to management, and finally is able to just deal with the real weirdness that often pops up in our industry, the better off we'll be. All right, so blatant sales pitch, and Steve, thank you very much. Jamie, thank you very much for inviting me. And does anybody have any questions, comments, arguments, or anything else? Well, all right then. So, all right, I had timed this for discussion, but we are going to end about 10 minutes early, which in my experience, nobody has ever complained about. So thank you very much. And Steve and Jamie, back to you.
All right, Neil, thank you. That was really great. Both very informative and entertaining, which I appreciated. I guess I'll give a last call for any comments or questions here. But if not, again, thank you, Neil, for joining us, and thanks for Steve for inviting us to co-host this event. Steve, did you want to say anything to close up?
No, just thank you to Neil, and thank you to you, Jamie, for your help with this. And have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Yeah.
All right, very good. Take care. Have a great evening. Thank you very much for coming. Take care.
Good night, everyone.